Welcome back. You watching The Fix. I'm Karima Brown. Now, the testimony this week of 4 of South Africa's major banks about their efforts to stop doing business with the Guptas exposed the ugly underbelly of the political support for the state capture project enjoyed among certain coteries of Jacob Zuma's, both in the executive and in the African National Congress. It also exposed the fight put up by Pravin Gordhan, who refused to legitimize an illegal instrument, the so-called Interministerial Committee headed up by Mosebenzi Zwane, but willingly aided by Labour Minister Mildred Willifant, both of whom strong-armed the banks, with Zwane going further and asking them to break the law to rescue the Gupta businesses. To get a perspective from this sector, we are now joined by Cass Kuvadia, Managing Director of Banking Association South Africa. Cass, good evening. Welcome to the program.
Good evening. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, of course, it was a very difficult week to listen to executive after executive explaining what exactly they went through. Before we continue with the conversation, for those perhaps who haven't heard what the banks had to say, let's take a quick listen. Let's start off with Nedbank.
In my 32 years in banking, this is the first time ever I've received requests from a political party or an interministerial committee to want to discuss banker-client relationships.
Minister Zwane commented that he found it surprising that other banks had refused to attend the IMC meeting with government, considering that banks receive their licenses from government.
What did you take that to mean?
I also found it to be a very strange statement. I think it felt like a form of a threat. It is also a technically inaccurate statement because banks do not receive their licenses from government. They receive their licenses from the Reserve Bank, which is constitutionally an independent body.
That is of course, really, really hectic statements from 2 of the major banks in our country, Kaz. As someone who heads up the Banking Association, how have you dealt with this matter? And do you think the Zondo Commission of Inquiry is going to get us to a point where people like Mosebenzi Zwane and others are actually going to be held accountable?
Well, on your last question, I hope so. I think, I'm sure you would appreciate that the Banking Association itself wasn't involved in this because this was an issue between the 4 banks individually and their client and the regulator. But what's come out this week shows that attempts were made to actually compromise a sector of our economy that has international credibility, that is very well regulated in our country, and essentially saying that we shouldn't be robust and responsible in the way we do business. I think it also demonstrated a tendency to run roughshod over constitutionally independent structures, to run roughshod over legislation and regulation that govern banks, and to actually threaten institutions, business institutions. And that has got to be a worry, and those sorts of people must be brought to account, undoubtedly.
Yes, my understanding is that some of these bankers will be back at the Commission in weeks to come or months to come, and that the Commission has the right to ask them to talk about the details of clients' accounts. Is that correct?
Well, I'm sure the committee has the right to ask them. I mean, under South African law and international best practice, banks aren't compelled to provide reasons.
Not even in a court of law?
Well, in a court of law, under instructions from, in this case,
Judge
Zondo, they might consider doing that.
Yeah.
But
so we could actually see details
of
these accounts beginning to come out.
Now, this brings me to a criticism that the banks received from the economic freedom fighters. They were saying that these banks were very happy to do business with the Guptas until unceremoniously the Minister of Finance, Nhlanhla Nene, was removed. By that time, the Gupta corruption machine was long in action and facilitated. It goes on to say that it is impossible that the banks only started to notice the suspicious transactions, as late as they are. They're effectively saying that the banks were happy to do business, even if it was dirty business, because it was good money. What do you say to that?
Well, the EFF seems to have more information about banks' business than I do, quite honestly. Firstly, I mean, the firing of Minister Nene had nothing to do with this, okay? What the firing of Minister Nene did was actually raise the public profile of what was happening, and the Gupta's role in what was happening, okay? Banks in this country, a few years ago, the major banks were fined hundreds of millions of rands because the Financial Intelligence Center Office and the Reserve Bank felt that the systems they had in place to actually identify nefarious activity going through those accounts were not strong enough. Not that there was activity, but the systems. So they take this very seriously. If the flags were risen well before they closed the accounts, they would have actually closed the accounts before then. So it's not in the interest of banks from a reputation point of view. It's not in the interest of banks from a regulation point of view and the downside of actually not meeting the regulations. It's not in the interest of the bank from a pure business point of view to keep doing business with people who could actually bring all of that to come to bear. So I think, the economic freedom fighter obviously is entitled to its opinion, but banks just don't work that way, certainly in my knowledge.
Peter?
Do you think, do you think that the testimony we heard last week and as we'll hear it as it goes forward will change banking in any way? I mean, how will it change? What will banks look like in 10 years' time after all of this?
Well, I'm not too sure it would change banks in any great way. The reality is that what this actually shows, the testimony actually shows, is that we have regulations, a regulator and a regulatory environment that does enable us to pick these things up and does enable us to take action against people like the Guptas and Oak Bay and so on, okay? Similarly with any other clients that might be behaving in a similar way.
Yeah.
What question it could raise are these systems robust enough? Do we need to do more? Do we need to learn any lessons from this? But I don't think it will change the nature of banking or the way banks do business. The banks have actually done business very well in these circumstances.
A lot of countries of South Africa's size have state banks, a state bank or two. In fact, we have some.
We have some,
in one form or another, but not necessarily in the kind of retail space. And it's slightly off the question, but it does raise the question of what would have happened if we had a state bank 3 or 4 years ago. What use it might have been put to. Does what happened make the case for a state bank more or less strong?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, we've engaged in this whole debate on the state bank. And firstly, we don't have a problem in principle with the state bank, provided
Spain has one, the Italians have
and so on.
one.
The question I've often posed is, what do you want a state bank to do that banks can't do, okay? So what we should be doing is we should be asking ourselves, why are banks whose business is lending and where they actually make the money, not lending in certain markets? It's not because they don't want to lend in those markets. And so how do we, banks and government, work together so as to enable banks to manage risks in those markets and begin lending in those markets? At the end of the day, what's a bank about? It's taking your money and mine in trust, gearing that, and then lending that for productive activity and other activity in a way that they get that money back. A state bank has to do the same thing.
Sure.
If you lend money and you don't get it back, the only outlet is the fiscus bails you out, and we don't have money to do that.
And
Well, one of the things that I wanted to ask Peter and Cass is, of course, the roles played by the different actors. We know Musibenzi Zwane was the kind of, chief cheerleader. Mildred Oliphant was still in the cabinet, by the way, urging him on. But we also have a meeting of Gwede Mantashe, Enoch Godongwana, Jesse Duarte, and of course Krish Naidu in one instance. Gwede Mantashe has said that there was nothing nefarious about it. The meeting was open. What amazed me, Peter, was that so many black business people, legitimate businesses, have often complained that they can't get access to capital, that they can't get financial institutions to take them seriously because they don't have assets, they don't have generational wealth. I've never seen the African National Congress intervene on behalf of a Montlana or a traditional black business. The extent to which the African National Congress intervened on behalf of a family whose proximity to the president is so close that we're now looking at whether or not he outsources executive authority is, of course, a slap in the face for every single black person who's ever tried to get money out of a financial institution and struggled with very little assistance from the African National Congress.
Oh, well, look, I think any political party interfering on behalf of any client of any bank is dangerous, okay? And we need to frown on that. We need to criticize that in the strongest terms, and we need to ensure that it doesn't happen again. If there's a sector of the community that's complaining legitimately or otherwise that they are not getting services from the banking industry and for a relevant government minister to engage the banking industry on that, I don't have a problem with that at all. Okay, but to engage the banking industry to identify what the problems are to see if we can resolve it. But here, to actually intervene on behalf of a client and to actually call bank CEOs to meetings to talk about a particular client is totally unacceptable, and we must be absolutely clear about that.
Although you'll be, I'm sure, aware, and banks close during lots of accounts during the year. But they also do business with some. They continue to do business with some pretty nefarious people. How does a bank strike that balance? I mean, let's assume that in a bank there's one guy and he's got 3 accounts that he watches. A Gupta's, and he watches a guy who's a known cigarette smuggler, and say somebody else, a building contractor or whatever it might be, who might be colluding on contracts or whatever. How do banks decide that enough is enough?
Yeah.
Well, if they pick up activity going through those accounts. So in the current regulatory environment, in the Financial Intelligence Center regulatory environment, if you're a politically connected person, influential person and so on, banks should look at that account much more closely than they'd look at.
Does a red light go on somewhere?
Yeah, a red light goes on. And if then there's suddenly activity in that account that's very unusual, then a red light should go on, and the bank should report that to the Financial Intelligence Center office. If a bank fails to do that and they fall foul of regulations later on, then they must bear the consequences of it.
Just as a final question, we're running a little bit out of time. Judge Zondo pressed one of the executive, I think it was the one from F&B, to ask why they didn't engage the client. And he cited a court case where he said contractually they're not obligated to explain themselves. I was quite puzzled by Judge Zondo's insistence that it might be perceived to be unfair. I mean, either party can opt out of the contract with no explanation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And look, again, I don't know anything about any individual bank's relationship with its client, but I read in the paper that some bank did explain. And that's their prerogative to do so, but they're not compelled by law to do so.
All right, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you so very much. That is, of course, Cass Kuvadia. That was the Banking Association of South Africa's managing director, speaking to us there on the testimonies of the various banks at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. Welcome back to The Fix with me, Karima Brown. This week, Cosatu made history and elected its first woman president in the Federation's over 30-year history. Zingiswa Losi is also a member of the African National Congress's NEC and the South African Communist Party's Central Committee. Some would argue an ideal candidate to champion a so-called reconfigured alliance, a key demand of the ANC's leftist allies. But it could potentially also put her at odds with her greatest challenge, and that is to foster unity among South Africa's fractured labor formations. She now joins us in the studio. Zingiswa Losi, thank you so much for joining us, and of course, congratulations on this historic election of yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on the show.
Well, you get in there with boots and all. The week in which you get elected, the president of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, announces a stimulus package to deal with some of the questions that you've been putting on the table, which is the issue of jobs, the questions of poverty, the questions of inequality. Let's quickly take a listen to the president speak about that stimulus package.
The measures we are announcing give priority to those areas of economic activity that will have the greatest impact on youth, women, as well as small businesses. The stimulus and recovery plan has a number of broad areas. Firstly, the implementation of growth-enhancing economic reforms. And secondly, reprioritization of public spending to support job creation. In other words, we are reprioritizing our current budget to focus on the very urgent issues that can have an impact on our current economic situation. Thirdly, we'll be establishing an infrastructure fund, what we call a South Africa Infrastructure Fund. We'll give details about that in a little while. Fourthly, we'll be addressing urgent and pressing matters in education and in health. And the fifth one will be investing in municipal social infrastructure improvement. In the various municipal areas in our country, there are dire needs that need to be addressed with immediate effect.
That, of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa being quite, systematic about some of the measures. Let me start off by asking you, Zingiswa, was Labour consulted on this stimulus package? A lot was made today about how Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma facilitated business coming to the party together with someone like Rolf Meyer. What role, if any, did Cosatu have in the president's stimulus plan he announced to the country?
We must say that we were not part of the processes on the stimulus package and the conceptualization of it. No, we were also lent when the president made the announcement on the stimulus and the areas where government will be putting money in terms of job creation and all of that, as he has mentioned. But I must say that we were not party to the processes.
If you were not part of the processes, what is your reaction? Your rival federation, SAFTU, has said it's old wine in new bottles. It doesn't deal with structural issues. It doesn't deal with the question of unemployment. What is Cosatu's official position vis-a-vis what the president has announced, and are you going to back him on it?
Cosatu has welcomed the announcement by the president. Look, what the president is putting on the table is addressing the issues that we have concerned with. So it cannot be correct that every time when issues are coming, the only thing that we can do as LIPA is to throw stones. At some point, we need to reflect on, is it responding? It may not respond entirely, but there is a movement. And of course, it comes at a point when we are dealing with the envisaged retrenchments at the SOEs. You would have known that SABC, ESCOM, and other SOEs are having impending retrenchment in the mining sector and also in the public sector, even though the president has assured us that there will be moratorium on all retrenchments, public and private sector. So indeed, Cosatu is welcoming, and we're saying we're prepared to work with our government to ensure that we really do away firstly with corruption, because our concern is with what is going to be put in this infrastructure plan, we are worried because history has taught us that when government puts money in, there are people sitting there waiting to drain it out. And we want to say to government, we must learn from our mistakes of the past. When we put this stimulus package, we must be able to ring-fence and ensure that there will be no state capture and corruption as a result of what government is putting in. You know? So at the end of the day, as the Federation, we are saying officially that we welcome, we hope that it's going to address all these number of issues, and we hope that as we're going to the Job Summit and the Investment Summit, this issue is going to be built up for us to be able to see, as President have said, growth, employment in our country, and decent jobs, of course. So indeed, we are not rejecting it at all, but we're saying it is one step towards a good direction.
Peter?
Yeah, well, thank you, and congratulations also from me on your appointment. I wanted to ask you a broader question beyond the stimulus package about how Cosatu might approach our economy. And the big thing that we seem to miss in our economy is trust, right? Nobody trusts anybody, right? So we're all in our trenches, business over here, the government over there, the unions, or two unions in each of their own trenches. How do we create a high trust economy from a low trust economy where you know, if business says something, you listen to them. If the union says something, it gets listened to, rather than we just fight all the time. And we're all South Africans. We're all in the same hole. How are you going to approach creating trust, wider trust, in our economy or our society?
We believe that just like we did with the issue of the national minimum wage, we should be able to do the same on all other issues. That we should be able to put things on the table, be transparent with one another. Because without labor, government, and business, including civil society, we are not going to be able to take this country forward. Yeah. So we need to understand what is the interest of all of us about our own country. And when we're able to answer that question, and when we answer that question, we don't answer it in different directions, but we realize that all of us as South Africans, this is what we want to see our country going forward. Yeah. And when we're able to answer it, and then of course, we are different role players in ensuring that we're able to achieve the issue that we have identified as one issue that is going to take us forward. And we're able to lay the cards on the table from all different players. And once we're able to do that, Karima and Peter, I think the levels of trust will be able to be built, like we did, as I've said, with the national minimum wage. When we dealt with that issue, of course, we had researchers that were able to tell us, so that as labor, we're able to check ourselves, business is able to check ourselves, government is able to say, are you realistic from both ends? And that's how we're able to come and meet each other at a particular point and say, this will be a starting point because we all understand where we want to be and we're going to move forward.
I have this sort of fantasy about the South African economy where, and it's the kind of German model where unions sit by law on the boards of German companies. Would you be uncomfortable with legislation that proposed doing that in South Africa?
Actually, we would want to see workers participating, because what we have always argued is that we attempt to be stakeholders in companies that were employed. And at times when decisions are taken about us, without us, we say, okay, we're stakeholders, we're holding the stake and others are eating it. And I think it is about time that being a stakeholder means literally being able to sit on the table, get to understand where this business is going, get to say in the interest of labor and all of us here, this is how we want to take this company forward, guarding the interest of workers, of course. Sure. And then how are we going then to ensure that the jobs will continue to be secured so that we are able to secure the ones we have, but also create employment for those that are unemployed.
Peter, I want to come in here. I like the idea of what Peter's putting on the table, which is stakeholder capitalism. In some sectors, you've actually secured this, but it has led to other problems for you as trade unions. We've had a situation where shop stewards literally have their wages increased by about 5,000 to 10,000 rand. They get cars, they go on training courses. They're often not there to actually represent the workers. That's what led to Marikana. That's what led to the National Union of Mine Workers shedding jobs, business unionism. I remember your former president, Irvin Jim, opposing the idea put forward by Congress that the monies that you get from sitting on these boards, instead of getting paid to individual unionists, goes into a fund and funds the unions. This has divided you.
I'm going to argue with her quickly. I mean, you're talking about co-option, right? Yeah. And co-opting people is not the way the German thing works. I mean, in Germany, the unions have an active involvement right at the top of the company on decisions about executive pay, about what products to make. I see Porsche has just decided it is going to stop producing diesel engines. The union rep on the board would have had to put their hand up for that. We've got
some unions like that, like Cosatu, for example, who've actually taken over factories like Monatics and so on.
Yeah.
But I think what the issue of the sins of incumbency has visited you, Zingiswa, and it has led to a massive decimation of your individual affiliates. You have the decimation of SAMU, of SACAO, of SEPAO, all fighting about monies and not servicing workers.
I agree with you, Karima, and those are the challenges that have been confronting us, and we must be open about them and be honest about them. That is why, coming out of this National Congress, we have said that workers themselves must take control of their unions. You see, it starts very small. When a shop steward gets all of this, and there is no accountability to members. Because let me tell you, some companies, when they give you vehicles, at times, those are union-negotiated vehicles for the purpose of a shop steward to go and service members inside the company, outside the company, the CCMA, but also assist the union in doing the union work. Those are negotiated cars. They don't belong to shop steward. They belong to the trade union because they are negotiated. At the time when shop steward begin to fight about these issues, it is when workers must be able to ask them, because they were placed there by workers. That is why we're arguing that workers must take control. They must take over their unions now and say to shop steward, but when we elected you, we elected you for the purposes of you servicing us. It cannot be correct that a shop steward will go, take a mandate from workers, go to management, sit in the boardroom, come out, go for lunch, never come back, does not call a general meeting, and the gap widens. And by the time that shop steward wakes up to go back to members, there's already a revolt.
We're out of time, but I cannot let you go without asking you, are you going to lead negotiations with NUMSA so that there's unity among yourselves as trade union federations?
The mandate of the 13th National Congress of Cosatu said, Cosatu, we must be reminded of our founding principles, of a unity within unions inside Cosatu, outside Cosatu, in all federations to unite workers in this country. And that means including extending a hand to NUMSA.
All right, that's where we will have to leave it. Thank you so much. That was Zingiswa Losi, of course, Cosatu's first female president. Well, now that you've had your fix, we will see you next Sunday. Take care and good night.